We read this morning from the Hebrew Bible, from the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verses 1 through 2 and 15 through 18. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. You shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. With justice you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." The passage that I've just read was edited heavily, not by me, but by the compilers of the Revised Common Lectionary, because the passage is from Leviticus, which the lectionary holds at arm's length. In a 3-year cycle, we will read only a selected few verses of Leviticus. And this is a relief for a pastor because there's a lot of Leviticus that I frankly do not want to read from the pulpit. For example, there are 2 long and very graphic chapters on skin disease with recurring words like boil and itch and the color green. And those are not even the most disturbing chapters. Even when it's not disturbing, Leviticus is at least very strange. There are clear proscriptions against eating winged insects that walk on all fours, which, if you think about it, leaves the menu pretty much open. There are rules that are strange in a mild way. Don't sow a field with 2 kinds of seed. Don't wear clothing made of 2 kinds of fiber. There are rules that make us cringe. Rules about how one may and may not use one's slaves, or who should or should not be stoned to death. There are pages and pages of rituals. What will be sacrificed, how it will be sacrificed, and what the priest should wear when performing the sacrifice. To enter Leviticus is to enter a world that does not look a lot like ours. But looking different is actually the point. The best way to understand Leviticus is as a portrait that a community painted of itself in order to show to itself its own identity. The Israelites saw themselves as a distinct people, a chosen people set apart by God. That being the case, they wanted to look different from the cultures around them. They wanted to model themselves instead on the God they worshiped. They wanted to be holy as God is holy. And a holy God was itself a new idea. In the cultures that surrounded the Israelites, sometimes the deities were exaggerated portraits of humanity's worst qualities. But Israel's God was completely different from humanity. Separate, distinct, wholly other, holy. And Israel shall be holy as God is holy. This is the overriding message of Leviticus. For the Israelites, separation was a theological matter, and the Levitical code was a way of living that theology. The lines that painted the community's self-portrait were actually a series of boundaries. These boundaries separate the profane from the sacred. They mark where life crosses from the ordinary into the extraordinary. For the Israelites, the boundaries in Leviticus marked where sacred space began. The people of Israel understood themselves as ones who lived within sacred space where holiness was found. But over millennia, it has proved impossible to keep those boundaries nailed in place. Because the boundaries in Leviticus make up a complex symbolic system, and the symbols translate poorly over time, leaving us with a lot of details that even the greatest interpreters find baffling. Our God is unchanging, but our symbolic understanding is not, and neither is our moral understanding. What religious person today would draw a line around a space in which slavery is allowed and call that space sacred? The boundaries do move. We are ever in pursuit of a clearer understanding of the sacred. A number of years ago, a friend enlarged my dimensions of sacred space. This was in the 1990s, and we all remember what happened to the Moravian Book of Worship in the 1990s. And I, hidebound, was complaining to my friend about the removal of thee and thou from our liturgies and our hymns. I declared that the sabotaging of our texts deprived us of a sacred language. And my friend, who is a Buddhist, gently suggested that if language could communicate with God, then all language is sacred. Which brought me up quite short, I can tell you. Now, I did get my revenge some months later when this same friend was describing a cross-country trip as one long string of flight cancellations and delays and traffic problems and missed connections, all minor catastrophes, and I told him, gently, how glad I was that his Buddhism had allowed him to enjoy all these experiences as gifts from God and therefore sacred. His reply suggested that as a Buddhist he needed more practice. Life is messy. Life is full of mistakes and problems and conflicts and suffering. And it is lived in mortal bodies, which, as Leviticus reminds us, are very messy indeed. But the theological genius of Leviticus is its confidence that in the midst of this mortal mess lives holiness. Because boundaries are also lines that connect one part of life to another and give it meaning. Interpreter Mary Douglas calls Leviticus a theologically profound vision of the complexity and interdependence of the created order. And the point of deepest connection is the most sacred space. And Leviticus tells us still exactly what that sacred space looks like. Sacred space is the place where you shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. With justice you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Here at the center of Leviticus, even with all the strangest verses whittled away by the lectionary editors, we still encounter a world that doesn't look a lot like ours, because it is a world of justice and kindness. A world where each citizen is accountable for his behavior toward his neighbor. A world where no citizen slanders a neighbor or profits by taking advantage of a neighbor. A world where one does not take vengeance or bear a grudge against a neighbor. Who do the Israelites want to be? They want to be the people who live in that world. That was the identity they named holiness. That is the unchanging sacred space of holiness, the one Jesus would reference many centuries later in the Gospels, the world in which one loves one's neighbor as oneself. Which means, not incidentally, that sacred space contains neighbors. It is apparently impossible to achieve holiness all by yourself. It appears that you have to engage with at least one neighbor. Barbara Brown Taylor says, "The world's great religions have always required communities of people to make them work. Communities are the concrete places where the teachings of the religion are tested. Sometimes," she says, "the teachings explode in people's faces. Other times they save people's lives. Either way, the teachings mean little apart from the embodied practices of the community. Who knew this so well as the Israelites? Well, maybe the Moravians, who began life not as a church but as a community. In the winter of 1457-58, a group of young men hoping to revive the passion of the Czech Reformation established a community outside the Czech village of Kunval. There they sought to live out the law of Christ, which, like all of the law and prophets, could be summed up as love God and love your neighbor. 270 years later, when the people of Herrnhut signed the brotherly agreement, they were moved by something like the impulse that created the Levitical code. They wanted to create an identity as a holy community. For the residents of Herrnhut, that meant living out the teachings of Christ together. Who did the brethren want to be? They wanted to be the people who lived in that world. The brotherly agreement was the self-portrait of the community they wanted to be. Leviticus does not describe individual holiness because there is no such thing. Leviticus describes a series of relationships that happen in community, and relationships are the very stuff of which holiness is made. When you love your neighbor, you feel what he is feeling. If even for one moment you feel what another person is feeling, if even for one moment you are stirred to compassion, if even for one moment your instincts kick in and prompt you to care for that person as you would care for yourself, then at that moment, says Barbara Brown Taylor, you understand what it means to die to yourself. She says this can be as frightening as it is liberating. It may be the only real spiritual discipline there is. When in loving neighbor we die to ourselves, the boundaries between us dissolve. And if God is in the other person, then so also do the boundaries dissolve between ourselves and God. This is the experience of divine union, which Taylor describes as the often fleeting but fully memorable gift of escaping the small self long enough to glimpse a wholeness more real than the most real brokenness. Now, I said that the Israelites named their identity holiness, but of course that is not correct because the Israelites did not speak English. The Israelites used the word kadosh, but we translate that as holy, which is really just a late reshaping of a Middle English word, heilig, which, believe it or not, simply means whole. When we say God is holy, we are just saying that God is whole. Now, in a theology of separation, what makes God so distinct is God's wholeness that is unbroken and unblemished, not missing any pieces. But Leviticus is also a theology of interconnectedness, in which we might view God as whole because God contains all the broken pieces, all the blemished pieces, even all those skin diseases and messy bodies and messy relationships and everything that makes up life in community. It's all part of this life God has created, all of which exists in God. Holiness springs from life together. In the sacred space defined by love of neighbor, what we discover is ultimately not separation, but union. Not that I am different from you, but that I am you. In loving our neighbor as ourselves, we arrive at the place where the boundaries disappear, because that is the place where we dwell in wholeness with God and our neighbor together. Amen.